I'm talking to you, both of you, and you're Muslim. You're excited about research. These things are interesting, and what really breaks my heart about this kind of video is that it doesn't just show me as having some kind of ulterior motives, but it also shows the ERC, the European Research Council, as funding, being interested in questions like undermining Islam and finding mistakes in the Quran. And this puts Islam in such an antagonistic position against research. And I just don't, I think that's that that's so bad. It's so bad. The idea that Islam could not be in a productive relationship with research is just absurd, and that Muslims could not be in a productive, and that Muslims themselves could not be doing research within the academy. It's just none of that is true, obviously.
Peace, people, and welcome to another installment of Real Talk with Tehran and Roxana. Today, we have a remarkable guest with us to discuss the intriguing world of Quranic Arabic. Dr. Marijn van Putten is a renowned scholar in the field of Quranic Arabic at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and has dedicated his career to understanding the intricacies of the language. He released his groundbreaking work titled Quranic Arabic: From its Hijazi Origins to its Classical Reading Tradition in 2022. And in the same year was awarded a consolidator grant by the European Research Council to investigate the language of the Quran further, both of which we'll be talking about today in this discussion. Thank you, Dr. van Putten, for joining us on our podcast to talk about your work and the latest research project you're involved with.
Yeah, wonderful. No, I'm very glad to be here. I really like what you guys are doing with the channel, so I'm happy to be here and talk about some of the things that are going on.
Yeah, and I speak for both of us that it is really nice to finally speak to you face to face, well, as face to face as we can, given our geographical differences.
Right.
Because I've been following you on Twitter for quite a while. I've been following your work probably even longer than that because I only jumped on Twitter so long ago. It was by way of Michael McDonald and Al Jalad's work. And we really appreciate a lot of
good friends both. Yeah, that's good.
And we appreciate a lot of the work that you two have, or you three have been doing. So, just to start, what made you decide to focus your research on the language of the Quran, being a non-native Arabic speaker?
It's I've had a funny path. My background is reading linguistics. I focus on lots of different languages. And I originally started off with Berber linguistics or Amazigh linguistics. And that's been a lot of fun, and I loved it, and I really enjoyed doing it. But especially when Ahmed Al-Jalad came to Leiden and started working with Arabic, and I had done some Arabic at the time, I really felt like he was asking some of the questions that were really, really relevant. Like, what's going on with this language? How is it developed? How's it going on? And I got a research grant to start looking into Arabic. So I published a little bit on Arabic here and there, Quranic Arabic, but also some historical dialectology. And I got a research grant to look at Arabic of the early Islamic period. And I kind of sold it as like, well, we've kind of figured out the pre-Islamic period now with Ahmed's work. We have a good sense of what's going on in the later period, but what's going on in this kind of pivotal moments. And I was originally going to look into Arabic as it was reflected in Judeo-Arabic letters, so written in Hebrew script and in Greek letters and these kinds of things, in Greek script or in Coptic, and kind of reconstruct the language of the conquests with it. But as I was looking into this, and I've been looking a little bit at the Quran, I was like, well, it seems kind of strange to ignore a 73,000 word book that can give us a lot of information about the language of this period, and that is the Quran. So I really came at it as an important linguistic source of this kind of 7th century period, and that's why I started looking into it. And as I started working on it, I started to really enjoy working with the manuscripts, which are so beautiful and so wonderful just to work with and kind of research and look at. So it was just a perfect time for it to come together. The Corpus Coranicum website went online. All these manuscripts were available. in a way that had never been before. So I kind of rolled into it. It wasn't a very directed attempt to go straight to the Quran. But that's where I ended up, and it's a lot of fun.
Very interesting, and I will second what you said about the Quranic manuscripts being extremely fun to look at. I mean, I haven't seen any up close and personal, maybe at the British Museum or what we have here in Manchester at the John Raylan. But yeah, just looking at them even digitally is fascinating. And it's very interesting that you talk about you're interested in Berber linguistics. This might not be the place to talk about it, but I know of the Ibadis in Algeria, and I remember coming across something that they may have preserved some of the some original Berber languages or something like that. Something I really want to look into, but haven't had a chance to dig deep. But maybe that's a topic
that's right.
I can talk
Yeah,
about.
no, maybe a topic for another time, but it is very interesting and it's true. So indeed, so there's a bunch of Ibadis throughout North Africa who are also, Berbers. So that's quite strongly interwoven in that region. So it's really interesting. So especially in Algeria. Yeah, great.
Okay, looks like a second podcast for us to have in the future. All right, so how did you end up writing a book about the topic on Quranic Arabic?
Yeah, so it's kind of, well, it didn't need to be that. For a long time, I didn't think I was going to write that. I thought I was going to write a book on Arabic of the early Islamic period, which was going to include the Quran, but also, these kind of other primary sources like Greek transcriptions and these kinds of things. And the more I worked on it, the more I feel like, no, there's a real story here, like a thing that can be told from a beginning to end, a kind of a narrative to tell something about, where did the language of the Quran start? How did it develop? And how do we end up with the reading traditions as we have them now? And I wanted to write that because I thought it'd be useful to write it. And so I kind of put my original focus of research to the side to really put that story kind of together. That's not the kind of book you usually write as a linguist. As linguists, we write grammars, and grammars don't have structure. They don't have a story. It's like, this is how the noun works. This is how the verb works. And I kind of still snuck that in the appendix of my book. But most of the book is really a story to tell, like, how have we conceptualized Arabic from this period? How have we conceptualized these questions? I'm sure we'll get into that in just a second. Yeah.
Okay, so how does modern linguistic analysis go about answering such complex questions? What is the language of the Quran, and how do we know? Which is quote I got from your book. Are there specific tools or methods that are particularly useful in this kind of research? For myself, having no knowledge of linguistics, that's just one of the questions that I really had in mind while I was collecting questions for this interview.
Yeah. So, well, it's the question. It's a central question of the book. So, there's a lot of answers to give here, and multiple people have given different answers. I just thought most of them were unsatisfying. A lot of people just said, well, the language of the Quran is what's in the Quran. Okay, but what's in the Quran? That's less obvious than people have made it out to be. There are these different reading traditions. There are places where the reading traditions seem to conflict with what is actually written in the rhyme and these kinds of questions. So when we want to answer this kind of question as linguists, and especially as a historical linguist, which I, most fundamentally am, I ask this from a development of the language perspective. So I look at it and say, okay, what do we know about Arabic from before this period? What do we know about Arabic after this period? And how can we place that within that development? And what kinds of tools do you have for that? Well, the tools that you have as a linguist, especially working with ancient documents, are things like you have to look at spelling. How are words spelled? Words are spelled in a way for a reason. When we talk about the English word night, why is it written with a GH? And depending on which night you mean, with a K in front of it as well. Well, it's because it used to be pronounced differently, right? So the Dutch equivalent to night is nacht. It says ch in it, and that's why you read it with GH. And So that's a very important tool, and one that's really hardly ever been used to really talk about the language of the Quran, because there's a real mismatch between what is recited and what is written. And people, well, had trouble deciding, can we trust this written text? Can we trust this recited text? And how do we get these two to work together? And so what I think you have to look at is, well, what kinds of hints can we get that this spelling actually has something to do with the language? Well, we're very lucky with the Quran. It's a rhymed text, so we can learn something through the language about by looking at the rhyme. This is, also how we reconstruct how Shakespeare is supposed to be recited originally, right? Because he rhymes certain words which don't rhyme anymore. So you have to conclude, well, clearly they rhymed at the time, or he never rhymed certain words which would now rhyme today. So that must mean they were different at the time. And that way you can kind of get to these kinds of questions and figure out what's going on, and then just taking up as many sources as you can. We're very lucky with Arabic that we have a very rich and old and ancient grammatical tradition. So we have Arabic speakers writing about their language and how it works from quite early on. I mean, not as early as the Quran, but it's very early. So that's a very important source, and a source that I think never gets properly looked at. Everybody kind of works with this idea that they know what's in those books rather than looking at those books, and they like talking about those books and what kinds of narratives they tell, but without actually seeing what it's saying. So those are some of the sources you work with, kind of the questions you ask, philological questions. This is really more or less basic philology, but something that doesn't get done very much within Arabic, I would say.
And it's funny that you mentioned that you feel that looking at the grammarians have been overlooked. I remember you mentioning that in your book. I would have thought that would have been the first place.
Yeah.
Is there any reason for that?
Yeah. So it's hard to say. I mean, there's a reason, I think, but I do think the reason is bad, in the sense that it's very easy to, especially with Arabic, which has such a kind of stable history in classical Arabic or modern standard Arabic as we see it, to kind of think of it as this kind of unchanging monolith, and that whatever we come to think of as being, Arabic today, must have been like that, back in the 800s and even 700s in the case of Siboi. And that's just not the case. And so this idea that there's a standard and there's this general narrative that it was the grammarians who standardized the language. And everybody's like, well, if they standardize the language, I know what standard Arabic is. So therefore, I don't need to actually look at what these grammarians are saying, because we all know what the standard is. And even when people do read it, they always read it with this kind of assumption that they know what the standard is. And so they don't realize that what the grammarians are describing is not the standard they know at all. And so you get this weird kind of tension of putting your modern assumptions onto an ancient text rather than letting the ancient text speak for itself. That's really where kind of the tension lies working with these kinds of sources, which is super important, but also difficult in all kinds of ways. We're still talking about people who lived 130 years after the Prophet, if not more. But they are very important sources nevertheless. Yeah.
And why do you think the features of the Quran itself have been so overlooked in the study of Quranic Arabic? Why has the Quran almost not been allowed to speak for itself in terms of its own linguistic history?
Yeah, so the it's a it's a difficult question. It's hard to kind of, so that also to some extent kind of ties into this kind of modern view again. So this comes down to recitation of the Quran, where you see this very strong kind of sense that the printed Quran that we have today, and most of the time, if you walk to a bookshop, buy a Quran, you get the Quran written in the recitation of Hassan Asim. And that's not the only canonical reading, but it is a canonical reading that looks very much what becomes the classical standard. So people look at it as like, well, this is exactly what I learned in school. So therefore, this is Quran, and there's no real question to ask. The language spoken, around the 7th century is the language you speak today. And so you get that kind of sense of a lack of awareness of these sources, which is really true. Like even people working on the linguistics of Arabic, as recently as I would say, well, as recently as 2019, have never actually bothered to look at the Quran when they're talking about, what is in the Quran. And they'll tell you, there's no imala in the Quran. It's like, well, there is, you're just not looking at the right reading tradition. And so you get this strange kind of conflict between what is assumed to be the standard and what is actually the standard and what was the standard at the time. And so kind of historicizing that and understanding that, a person like Hafs, he dies like 180 Hijri. Like, even if, and I think we basically have how he recited the Quran, but it's still some time removed from the Prophet. And it is also significantly different from what 10 other people who lived around, or 20 other people who lived around the same time were saying as well. So if you're not aware of that kind of variation, you just, it becomes a very boring story. It's almost an accident of history. If the most popular recitation of the Quran had been very different from what was standard Arabic, I'm not sure if that could have ever worked, but, maybe we would have noticed much sooner that there's this kind of conflict here that needs to be resolved. So that's kind of how I look at it, or I think we should think about it.
I mean, in terms of the over-reliance on the Quranic reading tradition of Hafs, how has this sort of restricted academic research on the language of the Quran, particularly in the Western tradition as well?
Yeah, so I think it has, well, especially on a linguistic level, it shapes everything. I would be the first to say that when we talk about the Quranic reading traditions, these do not usually have very massive influence on theological questions. Some every now and then, everybody cites the same verses. People like talking, citing the verse of the ablutions. So that's sort of the Maida ayah 6. That's a typical example. And there's this question in Surah Maryam, verse 19. Where there's some ambiguity who exactly is impregnating Mary. Those are the standard things that we cite, but that's very few and far between. The reason why we always cite those two verses is because those are the two most significant ones when it comes to reading traditions. But when it comes to the languages, to the language and questions of linguistics, it is vital. Questions of how does verb agreement work? Well, that depends on what reading tradition you look at. When questions of, what is the plural formation of this word or that word, it depends on what reading tradition you look at. The question of, is there a difference? This is a famous example between anzala and nazzala, to send down. Well, that depends on what reading tradition you look at. So, and that's I would say a fairly central one, because people really like going off on some kind of symbolical meanings. I think the reading traditions show that there's probably not much of a difference in meaning going on there. But if you just look at Hafs, you can make this whole story about how it works, and then all you need to do is just pluck at one place and say, well, here someone else reads something else, and now your whole system falls apart. So putting these systems together on this very tiny aspect of the language makes you just totally misjudge the kind of variation that's there. And especially on like a descriptive level, like what is the language of the Quran like? It is essential to know as much as you can, and then kind of try and figure out, well, is there only one answer? Are there multiple answers? How do you get that together? Could there have been multiple answers or not? So those are the kinds of questions you look at. So it really does a lot. There's all kinds of things that get called, pseudo-correct forms that are not part of classical Arabic, and it's like, well, there's a reciter. He lived, in early 2nd century Hijri, who is still recited today all over North Africa, and he says an-nabi, and he doesn't say an-nabi. So if you start calling that wrong or not Quran, what am I supposed to make of that? of course that's Quran, and of course it's Arabic, right? And it's not some weird pseudo correction, which, yeah, if you assume that Hafs is standard and everything else is just kind of like weird or on the side, that's assuming a standard that is not yet there and really takes a long time to even disappear. These forms like an-Nabi, even outside of the Quran, you'll find these forms in North African manuscripts until the 17th century. And so, we're applying this idea of what the standard is that wasn't even understood to be the standards in North Africa, in the early modern period. So those are weird impositions of the field at the time, especially in the West, where there was this kind of sense of like, we got to look at a standard and kind of make it standard if it isn't standard, right? And then that kind of reifies into a real standard. And this is a kind of pattern that we've seen in scholarship, especially in early modern scholarship, or well, let's say 19th century scholarship. This kind of sense of making a nice system. You'll see a very similar thing, patterns in Old Norse, for example. I've studied Old Norse years ago. I don't know it very well anymore. But the thing is, when they would make text editions, they would standardize it. So if they found a weird form in a manuscript, it's like, well, we all know it's supposed to be this. But of course, doing that, you are destroying all kinds of very important linguistic data just because you think you know what the answer is. The difference is that, for Old Norse, people figured out that wasn't the way to do it like 100 years ago. And with the Quran, well, I hope I figured it out, and I hope some people agree with me now, but it never really happened. And that's kind of that norming and normative way of looking at the language really kind of impacted everything.
I mean, in terms of the work that you've done in your book and how it differs from the sort of prevailing academic approach in terms of the dialect of the Quran, how have you been able to conclude that the dialect was Hijazi and not the sort of normative official poetic language that had been concluded by other academics?
Yeah. So that's a really so in some ways it's a big question. So anyone is looking to really know the full question, read my book, but which is free to download everywhere. But let me try to kind of sum it up. So what I did is I tried to look for the ground truth. And what I did with the ground truth is I looked at like, how is the Quran spelled? I think I've established quite nicely, we'll talk about that probably a little bit later, that the text is really stable very early on. So around 650, the spelling doesn't change much anymore. And we have rhyme. And let's use those two things together to kind of say, what kinds of things can we say about it? And what other things, what kinds of variation exists? What do the grammarians tell us existed? And what do we actually see in the Quran? And if you start making that list, if you just start listing, typical example, the word for that, dhalika, in the Quran, in poetry can also be dhaka. But in the Quran, you only have dhalika. And in poetry, you get both very often, even within a single poem. And in the Quran, it's only, and we know this because the Quran basically starts with it. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. You don't say ذَاكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, right? So that's just one example. But then if you look at what the grammarians say, what's the difference between ذَلِكَ and ذَاكَ? Later grammarians will tell all kinds of stories about what the difference is. But the early grammarians are very clear. They say ذَلِكَ is what the Hijazis say. ذَاكَ is what the Najdis say. Or everybody else very often is the kind of answer you get. So if you actually start looking at those features you can see in the rasm, that is in the consonant skeleton of the text, and start looking at what those represent, every single time it is Hijazi, which is not something you could even do with classical Arabic, like standard classical Arabic. Those things get mixed. And you certainly cannot do it with poetry, where you get all kinds of mixing all over the place. But the Quran is very consistent. It is very few cases where it just has two forms and one is from one dialect and one is the other. There's a couple of cases that you could maybe cite. I would probably contest all of them, but they're there. But when you look at the overall pattern and the really regular things, it's every time it's Hijazi. And so I think there's only one obvious conclusion. It must have been composed in Hijazi Arabic, which is of course a expected outcome, at least if you don't have extremely revisionist views of what the Quran, where the Quran comes from. but it's good to know that those facts actually, work out and are working the way they should. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like what you've concluded in your book totally blows the theory out of the water about the Quran possibly coming from further north. If the Arabic of it tends to always lean towards the Hijazi dialect. One thing that I found really interesting in your book, and I don't know the intricacies of it due to my lack of understanding linguistics, but I'm just going to give it a shot. How do we know there was no Hamza and that it was added later? And what does that mean for the unbroken oral tradition? Just imagining that there's no Hamza in the Arabic language for me was mind blowing.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting question. It's once again a nice example where really looking at different reading traditions gives a different perspective. But how do we do this? So let's first talk about, for listeners along, what is a Hamza? Hamza is what we in English call a glottal stop. It's the as in glottal. And it's in the word mu'min, for example, or bi'r, or shay at the end, or sama. And if you look at what the grammarians tell us about Hijazi dialect, they tell us time and time again the Hijazis had no Hamza, unlike the Najdis or unlike others who did have it. So instead of saying mu'min, the Hijazi said mu'min, and instead of bi'r, they said bir. And instead of yas'alu, they said yas'al. And that fact is reflected in the orthography. And this is something that we've noticed for a long time. When you write mu'min, you don't write, you write mim, waw, mim, nun. And that's an unusual spelling because if we look at pre-Islamic Arabic, and this is where this comes into play, what letter do they use to write Hamza? They use the alif. So a word like mu'min, you'd expect it to be written mim, alif, mim, nun, if it was really pronounced mu'min. So it looks like it is writing mu'min, but the reading traditions, some of them at least, read it as mu'min. And so just going by the orthography, you already go like, well, it's clearly at least intended to write a dialect that doesn't have Hamza. But just because it's using an orthography that is meant for something that doesn't have Hamza, doesn't mean the language of the Quranic composition that doesn't have Hamza. So that's those are two different things, right? Spelling can be different from pronunciation. So how do you show that what the orthography, so the spelling seems to show that is actually what the language of the Quran does? Well, to get at that, you have to start looking at rhyme. And what you will see in rhyme, there's not many places. There's like 4 or 5, maybe a bit more, of words where if you drop the Hamza, the rhyme works better. So this is in Surah 55, I think, where sha'n rhymes with tukadhiban, which works much better if it rhymes as shan tukadhiban, right? And that's exactly what you'd expect. That's what the spelling seems to suggest. And there's a couple of other cases like this where you can kind of play around with these different options, where every time you look, the rhyme works better without the Hamza. So that really suggests that the rhyme seems to suggest that what your orthography is representing is indeed what is in the language. Now, there's this pervasive idea, well, but the Quran obviously had Hamza because, we open up a Quran and there's Hamza in there. It's very important to note that the letter that we know as Hamza did not exist at the time and had no way of writing it. So, it really had to be added, which is why you still write it as a waw, but you write a little Hamza on top, or you write alif with a little Hamza on top. It's an extra sign, a sign that gets invented in maybe the 2nd or 3rd century Hijri. We don't really know when it happens. The earliest texts that we have it, except for the Quran. But that's, those are mid-3rd century. So, where was I going? And so this, and indeed, Hafs has a very conservative pronunciation of the Hamza in his recitation, although not in all places. There's one place he drops the Hamza where most other readers keep it, which is in Kufuwan. That's in Surah Al-Ikhlas, you will probably have learned to recite it as kufuwan, but it's kufu'an in most other recitations, actually all of them. So kufuwan is unique to Hafs. So not even the other transmitter of Asim, Shoba, reads kufuwan. He reads kufu'an too. So this is a very nice example where, even when we take all the rules and talk about the standard, there's a place where Hafs is not behaving like standard classical Arabic. But of course, because we all assume that this is the standard, we think, oh, that's a normal form. But when you think about it, it's a very strange form. What kind of noun would that be? What kind of noun ends in u? Those don't exist in Arabic. There are words that end in u with a hamza, and so those do exist. So, but then if you start looking at other reading traditions, you'll see, Warsh reads mu'min. He doesn't read mu'min. Abu Ja'far reads mu'min. Doesn't read mu'min. Abu Amr has as an option to read mu'min and can also read mu'min, depends on what he feels like, basically. So those forms exist, and no single canonical reading tradition has no hamza at all. But there's a good chance that there were reading traditions around. Now that brings me to the second part of your question that you had. What does that mean for the unbroken oral tradition? Yeah, what does it? What does that mean for the unbroken oral tradition? That's an interesting question and a difficult question. Although I think the Islamic tradition is very kind of robust against an attack, if we want to call it that, from this direction. Because if we think about it, these things don't matter, right? A mu'min and a mu'min are the same thing. That's not very important. So linguistically, I mean, I get excited about hamzas, but I can totally understand that people are like, well, why is this guy so excited about hamzas? And so there's this tradition within the Islamic tradition, from the Prophet, who then says that the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf, 7 modes, words, letters, edges, who knows? We don't really know what this word means. But what's very clear from the context of this hadith, and it's a very early hadith, it's very clear, it's very early. What's clear from this hadith is that it's about oral variation, about differences between reciters. So, and the Prophet, in a sense, giving an allowance to recite the Quran in multiple ways. Now, how literally you take that? Did the Prophet really recite every single word in every single way possible? Or did he just say, well, this guy can recite in that way, and that guy can recite in that way, and it's all fine, and that lady can recite in another way? That's kind of something you can play with, but there's clearly kind of an allowance for this kind of variation. And these kinds of questions is not what the Quran in its essence is about. And so when linguistic norms start shifting and what kinds of things these reciters were, let's say, exposed to, they would go every now and then and say, you know what, I will, recite this word with a hamza, or I'll start reciting the whole Quran with hamzas, or I'll do this or I'll do that. And there's a kind of selection procedure, and what the readers are doing is really a kind of selection. It's a kind of intellectual exercise, right? They are trying to make the Quran beautiful, which I think they see as their religious duty, and they think maybe the Quran is more beautiful with hamza. Why those kinds of things shift, that's ultimately a social linguistic question. It's kind of hard to really get at. But it's not, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no oral tradition. If you would ask me, well, did the Prophet really, really recite and teach every single variant that is in the reading traditions? I think that's very unlikely. But I think that's taking too literally what this is about, because then we talk about hundreds of thousands. Well, that's not right, but tens of thousands of permutations. It's like, well, did he really go with every single time that he said alayhum? He said, well, you can also say alayhim, and in this verse you can also say alayhimu, and in this verse you can also say alayhimi, and you can go and just explode the amount of variants, and that's just within the canon. Then you can also go outside of the canon where there's even more things which have perfectly good isnads, and it's all good. So how do you go about this? Well, you can kind of play around with this, but ultimately there is a text. There's a written text that's very important. I think within the transmission of the Quran, there are parts where, well, we might get into in a second, And there's ways of reciting this, and there's ways of reciting that are all Arabic according to grammarians. They say, well, this you can say this, you can say that, and it's all fine. And as long as it's all Arabic, it all kind of follows the language of the Quran in that sense. It doesn't follow the language of the Quran probably as the Prophet recited it or his closest companions did, who were all Hijazis, but it is Arabic, and it's not fundamentally changing the message of the text. So that was a kind of leeway they had, and I think really purposely exploited. They wanted to use that leeway to kind of play around with questions of language.
Oh, wow, you said a lot. There was in one part of what you were talking about, I wanted to interject because a lot of what you were saying sounds like it relates to something that happened, I want to say a couple years ago with the holes in the narrative controversy or scandal or situation, where at one point Yasser Qadi was asked by Muhammad Hijab, if I was to give you a blank piece of paper and ask you to write the Quran, would what you write on that blank piece of paper, calling it the Quran, would it match up to what we have in books? And he was hesitant to answer that question. I'm just curious if that is related to anything of what you mentioned.
Yeah. I'll try not to read too much into the mind of Yasser Qadi in this case, but I think this was ultimately about these kinds of questions of variation, and I do think that within the kind of apologetic circles, well, first on the polemical side, right? So Christians found out about these reading traditions and then started kind of hammering on it, and as a kind of apologetic backlash, this very kind of doctrinaire kind of push, like no, this is everything the Prophet said, all of this, and you just run into logical issues, and it's that simple. It's like you have to model this in some way that makes sense. And you cannot really say that the Prophet, who had many other things to do, was just teaching all of these variants and was, really for every single narration, front to back, the full Quran. You could maybe say he taught every single variant maybe one time in one place. That's, I think, still stretching credulity. But if you want to go with a fairly conservative version of the narrative, so to speak, that doesn't have holes in it, that's a reasonable way to do it. And I think that was kind of what Yasser Qadi was probably getting at. Yeah, I think that's right. It's not so simple, which doesn't mean, that just because there's holes in the standard narrative, and this is of course something that, it was certainly a awkward turn of phrase, let's put it, which once again, the Christian polemicists kind of jumped on. But it wasn't about, is the Quran preserved or not? I think, Yasser Qadi would obviously say the Quran is preserved, but it's not the kind of narrative that gets built around that, like how it's preserved or what the standard text is, or what the standard recitation is, or these kinds of things. The standard narrative had become something that clearly had, I think, logical holes in it, and you kind of have to think around that and think more flexibly about these kind of questions in a way that I think is in the spirit of the Seven Ahruf hadith, which is about this kind of flexibility in the text.
Very interesting. And you answered one of the questions I wanted to ask that was kind of off the record or off the script was, so with the, different reading traditions, are we saying that the Prophet, peace be upon him, sat and taught each one of these, for every single verse? That just really wouldn't make sense to me. No. So I guess that leads to how precise was the scribal preservation of the Quran? How do we know?
Yeah. So this has come up a couple of times already as we were talking about it. So very simply put, the written text is extremely, extremely accurate. And a couple of caveats have to be put here. So when we talk about the written text, the text that we have today, I think some people will contest this, like Stephen Shoemaker, but I think this text was standardized in 650 or around 650 by Uthman, as let's talk about the standard narrative tells us. I think there's no hole here. So the standard narrative here says that Uthman, the third caliph, said, was advised to make a standard text of the Quran, and had a copy made and then had 4 master copies made that were sent across the Islamic Empire. And then some narrations say he burned all the other versions or destroyed all the other versions. If that's something he really did, which I think might be plausible, he certainly wasn't perfectly successful, because people in the 3rd century are still citing the Mus'haf of Ibn Mas'ud, so clearly they had access to other versions from the Quran. But certainly his standardization was super successful. So how can we tell? Well, we have a whole bunch of early manuscripts these days. Really, 7th century manuscripts have been radiocarbon dated. We have also good art historical reasons to think that these are very early and probably pre-Umayyad texts, or on the super early Umayyad period. And these texts all are basically the same. There is some amount of variation between whether you write certain words with alif or not. But it's only specific alifs that get that kind of variation. But otherwise, it really is, as apologists like to tout, letter for letter the same text. And so how do we know this? Well, you can just look at them. You can look at 2 manuscripts and compare them, and it's like, well, this is a weird way of spelling this word, and this other manuscript spells it in the exact same way. Those kinds of things. And so I wrote a paper about this in 2019. Which is called The Grace of God as Evidence for the Uthmanic Archetype, or something along those lines. So what I do is I take a nice example of this kind of variation that happen, or weird spellings that happen in the Quran, and I take the phrase Ni'matullah, that is the grace of God. And Ni'matullah can be written in 2 ways. You can either write it with a ha, or you write it with a ta. It occurs 23 times in the Quran, 12 times in one spelling, 11 times in the other spelling, in just a normal modern print Quran. So I just figured, well, let's go look. How is it spelled in early manuscripts? And what you see is, when in the modern Quran it's written with a ta, it's written as a ta in every single early manuscript. And if it's written as a ha in the verse, it's written with a ha in every single manuscript. So this is extreme kind of, it is as if, this is, I try to give this as an example usually. If you see that 2 of your students hand in the exact same paper, well, that's kind of weird. You feel like, well, someone copied something from the other. But then if you see that they even have the exact same typos in the exact same places, it's like, well, I mean, they weren't just, they were almost photocopying it. And that's basically what you see. So, thinking of typos doesn't make much sense in a pre-standard way of writing, but there were just 2 ways of writing things. And what you see is that every single time the same writing is in one place and the other writing in the other place. And that kind of consistency only means one thing. All of these manuscripts that we have, all of these early manuscripts that we have, and also late manuscripts, but early manuscripts especially, that we have, are all being copied from one another. That is, they all go back to a single source which had a specific spelling, and then scribes tediously and painstakingly started copying every single spelling that they saw. That means 2 things. First of all, that all these texts descend from a single text. And if you go by dating, it's like, well, it can't have been much later than 650. As I said, Shoemaker would contest that and might want to push it maybe 40 years further. I really think that's difficult, but people have to make of the evidence what they want. But not only that, they don't just descend from a single text, but we also know something about the mode of transmission. Because if you say Ni'matullah, you can't hear if it's written with a ta or a ha, right? You pronounce it the same. It's the exact same pronunciation. It's purely a spelling difference. So if they're copying those accurately, that means that it wasn't a case that someone was reciting the Quran and other people were copying it or were writing down what they were hearing by dictation. No. They had a written exemplar in front of them, and they had a blank sheet of parchment next to it, and they started copying what they saw, letter by letter, painstakingly. So that shows us something about just the way they thought about the text, which I think also is important to realize. Not only did they think the text was very important, they thought it was so important that they really went out of their way to have the written form in front of them and copy it. They weren't just satisfied with purely the recited Quran. They were very, very interested in how the Quran was written and preserving that as well. And that's an interesting kind of fact of this early period, and kind of, I think, doesn't mesh so well with kind of modern conceptualizations of the Quran, where people like to say it's an oral tradition. Well, it's not. It's a semi-oral tradition, or there's some kind of thing, and the written text really matters. They really cared about it, even though this written text, is about 20 years after the death of the prophet. So there is a kind of time gap between this, right? So the text is very stable very early on, and we can tell, and it was being copied by hand from written exemplars. But it is some time after that. There is some room, and there's also uncertainty. What's going on before that? And we know that different companions had different forms of the Quran, were massively different, but they seem to have had some variance here and there in their text. Which seems to suggest, there was more variation before Uthman came along, which is exactly what the tradition tells us. The tradition tells us, we're afraid we're going to forget what the contents of the Quran are, so write it down. So Uthman writes it down. So there is this kind of, question of preservation and also shrinking of variation because of that. Because once it's written, you can't vary as much as once it's not written.
And it's very interesting that you said that companions had all different kinds of copies of the Quran. That was something I had no idea about until I read Arthur Jeffries' work.
Yeah.
While you were speaking, I was trying hard to say the name because it would sound real fancy if I could just say the title. But you know what work I'm talking about, and in of course, the introduction is in English, but then you have to know Arabic in order to continue engaging with that work. I was just surprised by the contents of the book, all the different companions that were listed, in Ibn Masud, but Ali ibn Abi Talib, and many other companions. So my question, some scholars have argued that Arabic writing was too primitive at the time of Uthman for him to have been able to collect and canonize the Quran. Do you agree with this? Do pre-Islamic inscriptions and early Arabic papyri have any bearing on this issue?
Yeah. So this is definitely I find it annoying. As in sense, this is very pervasive. Let's first get one thing out of the way. The Arabic script was not invented in 700. It wasn't invented in 600. It wasn't invented in 500. It wasn't invented in 400. It wasn't invented in 300. It wasn't invented in 200. It wasn't even invented in the year 100. It wasn't even invented in the year 0. As far as we can tell, people have been writing the ancestor of the Arabic scripts continuously for over a millennium before the Quran was written down. Yeah. We're talking here about the Nabatean script, which was the script of the Nabatean Empire. Nabatean Empire starts around 400 BCE. I think the oldest inscriptions that we have is 200 BCE, but someone will correct me if that's wrong. And the Nabatean Empire becomes part of the Roman Empire in 106 AD. And all the while, these people are using the Aramaic scripts. They're clearly, to some extent, Arabic speakers. And usually they write Aramaic, but every now and then they write Arabic. And the script continues to evolve and continues to develop throughout all this time. And so for hundreds of years, people have been using the script to successfully write Arabic. And it's a terrible script to write Arabic in. It really is a terrible script to write Arabic in. And this is absolutely true. It doesn't distinguish like most of the consonants of the language. That's a mess. It was much better with Safiric. You've had Mike McDonald on who's talked about these kinds of things. That's a perfect script. It has a sign for every single letter of the Arabic alphabet or the Arabic language. This script doesn't, but that doesn't stop us from using it. Just like, English spelling is the worst, absolutely worst script you could come up with, spelling you could come up with to write English with. It's insane. But that doesn't mean that we can't read it or that, the English script is too primitive to write English with. We're perfectly able to read English. Arabic is a totally different ballgame. It's not that bad. English is much worse than Arabic, even in the Arabic script. So yeah, it's true. The Ottomanic, in Ottomanic times, it was customary to write very few of the distinguishing consonantal dots. They did exist, because we have papyri. This is where the papyri become relevant. We have a papyrus from 22 Hijri. So this is before Uthman, a couple of years before the Uthmanic text. which clearly uses dots. It's very obvious. It uses those consonantal dots that we use today to distinguish them, but it uses very few of them. And it's not enough to make the text completely unambiguous. And it doesn't have vowel signs yet, but that's not a big problem. Most languages of the Middle East didn't have vowel signs for most of their history, and that didn't just language didn't just kind of fall apart. You should do this as a trick sometime. Just write English and just take away all the vowels. You can read it just fine, right? And because you are used to the language, it's much harder for people who don't know the language or who are not native speakers in the language to read the language. But for native speakers, having ambiguity in your script is not a big problem. And so for Arabic, it's not a big problem either. So it seems that, those consonantal dots, which according to Islamic tradition were invented only later, even after Uthman, which is clearly wrong. We can prove it's wrong. They were around, but they weren't used very often. And it's pretty clear that, when Uthman wrote down a text, well, every single manuscript that we have, especially early ones, have some amount of consonantal dotting. It's not a lot. It's not enough to disambiguate everything, but it disambiguates quite a bit. And you can really find manuscripts from the 7th century which really have quite a lot of dots, which is what, a very popular thing to say as well. When Uthman wrote the text, there weren't any dots yet, so he wrote it without dots, or he purposely left out the dots to keep ambiguity, to recite it in many different ways. These are two ways of talking about these things. I don't think that's borne out by the evidence. Every single early manuscript has these dots. Why would the Uthmanic text not have had it? And in fact, and this is a very nice paper by Adam Bursai, who wrote about this. It's called Connecting the Dots. It's what was the answer. The name for the title, the title of the paper was right there, and he took it, and I applaud him for it. Where he shows the dotting that we see in early manuscripts. They are not unusual. So they are very similar to how papyri use dots. So it's not a Quranic way of dotting the Quran and a papyrus way of dotting the Quran. It's the same way of doing it. It was just how you wrote Arabic. You wrote it with few dots. You wrote it, sometimes you left it out, sometimes you didn't. When you felt the need to make absolutely clear how to read a certain word, you put the dots. If you thought that the person reading it could figure it out, you wouldn't. And so, no, the script is fine. Is the script fine to have absolute certainty what the text is going to say? No, absolutely not. Is it clear enough that you are not going to read something just utterly different from what the Quran says? Yes, absolutely. It's really difficult, and people have been trying to get like really blasphemous or totally revisionist readings of the Quran out of redotting some things, because there is this thing, there's language, there's a structure to the language, we know how it works, and to get something reasonable out of it, and most of the time you need to get something reasonable out of it, you need to put the dots where you think they make sense. That's kind of where it comes down to. Yeah.
In relation to sort of the controversies that we're talking about, a video came out quite recently on YouTube about the European Research Council Consolidated Grant that you were awarded. The video was titled something like "Scholar Paid 2 million to Find Mistakes in the Quran," and it's amassed hundreds of thousands of views since it was released. Do you agree with how your research project has been characterized in that video, and can you please tell us how it differs from that characterization?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see me smiling. No, absolutely not. It's not a very good characterization of my research. Where do I start? So yeah, this video is uploaded to YouTube, and then all kinds of derivatives got made of it, which went up on TikTok and all these other social medias, got millions of views even. And the video keeps on getting shorter and shorter and becomes more and more wrong. The first video, it was already, I would say, dishonest. I have not been paid 2 million euros to find mistakes in the Quran. I, as a linguist, find the question of mistakes in the Quran somewhat meaningless. We can get into that if you want. But most of the rest of the video I thought was not too well, at least represented a research correctly, not the research that I was paid 2 million for, and not the research I got from the European Research Council, because that was the paper. Basically, what that video talks about is this paper that I just talked to you about the grace of God, which is a 2019 paper. I wrote it, and I had funding from the NWO, which is not the New World Order. It's the Nederlandse Organisatie voor Wetenschappelijk Onderzoek, which is the Dutch organization for scientific research, which has a very awkward name when you try to dispel conspiracies, but that's the way it goes. So that was part of my Quranic Arabic project. And, I stand behind my paper that I wrote in 2019. I think it's right that the text of the Quran is basically unchanged since Uthman until today. That's good, and I've never had any problem with Muslims, using that for apologetic purposes, because of course, that's something you can, especially have a strong belief of, preservation of the Quran being promised within the Quran. This is a good example of that happening. I think, taking that from a more secular perspective, I say, if you believe that the Quran says that the Quran needs to be preserved, you are probably going to try very hard to do so, and it's a human effort. But nevertheless, that people are excited about this and want to talk about this, I think that's perfectly reasonable. But what was going on with this video is that it said that I was paid to find mistakes in the Quran. I've not been paid to find mistakes in the Quran. I'm not interested in finding mistakes in the Quran. I got a research grant, which is true, from the ERC, 2 million euros, which is not all for me. I'm not, I'm not in some kind of golden castle right now. This is just to do research, and it's a big project that I got. I'm very excited. I'll have 2 PhD students on my project. I have 2 postdocs on my project. And me, we all need to be paid from these 2 million euros, and you'd be surprised how quickly you run out of that money if you have that. But it's a big project, and it's a project on the history and development of the reading traditions and the emergence of the canon of the Quranic reading traditions, which happens in the 4th century, and centuries later. I think it's a very exciting project, but it has nothing to do with this 2019 paper. In the sense of it's about the Quran and it's done by me, those are the only things that are there, and it's just, it has nothing to do with mistakes, so it's very irritating. And after that, of course, it gets distorted more and more and more until I'm just kind of like conniving Western academic trying to undermine Islam. It's like that's not what I'm interested in, and that's I get excited about Hanzas. That's not going to undermine Islam, and it pains me. So the reason why I don't like it, because I'm talking to you, both of you, and you're Muslim. You're excited about research. These things are interesting, and what really breaks my heart about this kind of video is that it doesn't just show me as having some kind of ulterior motives, but it also shows the ERC, the European Research Council, as funding, being interested in questions like undermining Islam and finding mistakes in the Quran, and this puts Islam in such an antagonistic position against research, and I just don't. I think that's so bad. It's so bad. The idea that Islam could not be in a productive relationship with research is just absurd, and that Muslims could not be in a productive, and that Muslims themselves could not be doing research within the academy, is just, none of that is true. Obviously you can do this, and it's very important that we do it. And whatever case there is, I think it's perfectly reasonable to want more people that don't look like this, non-Muslim white guy to be in the academy and work on these kinds of things, and have more Muslims work with the sources, talk about these things within the academy. Perfectly reasonable. That stuff has been developing, I think, quite nicely in the recent years. But you're not going to get there by casting the ERC, which is one of the main funding bodies, as kind of somehow antagonistic towards Islam. That is, it really breaks my heart. It's really, it gets to me. I just don't want that. I want people to do research and do important things and learn something about the history of Islam. whether you're Muslim or not. And that's just, that's just part of research. And so that's kind of how I feel about it. Yeah.
No, yeah, I remember when I first came across that video, really when it first came out. For some reason, I didn't think much of it. I just thought the title was clickbaity from the start. But then I saw on Twitter, you had commented on it, and you seemed to disagree with how your research and the grant was characterized. And I had wanted to bring you on for a long time anyway, but I was a little bit intimidated by your work because, as I mentioned already, just my relationship with linguistics, I just thought this would be a good opportunity to not only talk about your work and better understand it, but to also, give you a chance to clarify whatever mistakes or mischaracterizations you feel were going on with the video, because from when I looked into it, it did kind of spread. I mean, I didn't look into it on TikTok or any other social media platform, but on YouTube, it was already well over 500,000 or maybe close to a million if you just total all the videos together. And I just want to, Roxana and I just want to congratulate you on the grant that you were awarded.
Thank you.
Because even before being awarded that grant, we were following you on Twitter. You were very active on Twitter talking about your research, and you seem very enthusiastic about it. And I never got any kind of pernicious or ulterior motives behind what you were doing. And so, it's really nice to see that the right people are getting funded for the research that they have. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in, not to take away from the next question.
No, thank you.
Well, in terms of this research, are you able to share sort of any provisional results with us, particularly in terms of like how long the canonization of the reading traditions took?
So it's still very early, and I'm getting the team together. So I'm more or less done hiring most of the people on our project now. So, and they're only going to get started in January, my PhD students. So there isn't that much to talk about. Yeah, but I've already started with my postdoc, Jeremy Farrell, who will be doing the historical side of things. Is like, okay, how did the canon of the reading traditions come to be? Because this is the thing, right? So we have, in the 4th century, this guy Ibn Mujahid in Baghdad writes a book and saying these are 7 reading traditions, and it seems quite soon after him these 7 reading traditions really become quite popular. But what was happening before that? Did he just pick the only 7 that were still around? When did these 7 arise? These 7 are by people who lived, a couple of hundred years before him even. And so why these 7? And what else was out there? And so what I said in my proposal, what I want to look at more, and what I've been working on already, of course, is what's going on with the reading traditions before this period. So we don't have any descriptions in the literary sources from before this period. We have indirect references to it, but we don't have this like real description like Ibn Mujahid wrote. Those books probably existed before him, but we don't have them anymore. So his 7 really becomes very dominant, and then, as happens with canons, once there is a canon, the older books disappear and that kind of thing. But there's a way to know this. We can learn what the recitation of the Quran was like before this period, and what other variation was there. And that's by looking at actual manuscripts. So around the beginning of the 2nd century, we don't know exactly when, but let's say around that time, like early Umayyad period, let's say it's around that time, they start developing vowel signs in the Arabic script. These are red dots, so not the signs that we know today, but they're red dots. And these red dots can tell us a lot about how the Quran was recited according to the person who's putting those dots in there, right? So a difference between, what's a good example? Well, whether you read Al-Kutub, the books, or Al-Kitab, the book, that's something you could see once you put the vowels in there, right? So once that's there, you can look. And nobody's looked at these manuscripts. And it is really bizarre to me, because these manuscripts are from before Ibn Mujahid, so we can know what it was like. So I've published a little bit on this already. So I have one paper called Arab 334a, a Hijazi, non-canonical Hijazi reading tradition found in a manuscript, or something like that. And this shows, this manuscript is a very early manuscript, so it's like 8th century, early Umayyad period, and it has been vocalized. It follows a reading tradition, but it's none of the reading traditions that become the canon. Not the 7, not the 3 that were canonized later. It's something else entirely. It is a systematic reading that follows, good normal principles. In every way, it seems like acceptable Arabic, useful stuff, but it's not the one we know. It recombines variants that we know, so it's not one of these traditions. So I published that already, so that's kind of a result. It was a result before. I mean, I had to write that for them to give me the grant to show there's something to see here, of course. There's another paper that's I hope to finish very soon, where I have collected a whole bunch of these manuscripts, non-canonical manuscripts, which are reasons to think they're non-canonical. And so I collected them, and there's about 25, and they're very similar in the way they write the recited Quran. So they write the vowel layer, but they're all a little bit different from one another. But every single one is different from all the canonical ones. Yeah. So what does that suggest? It suggests that there's a real massive amount of variation that existed in how you recited the Quran. But these are not just, unsystematic, crazy things. They are systems. They are patterns. We can say something about the reading traditions in those manuscripts and learn something about how the Quran was recited before the canonization. And yeah, it turns out there's a lot of variation, and there's very few manuscripts that really follow the canonical readings that become canonical. So the question is, when do these canonical readings become popular? When do they become dominant? Was it just Ibn Mujahid who said, these are the 7, and everybody's like, you're right, those are the 7. And that was because of that, or was it sometime before that? And the question is obviously, and that's something I can definitely already say, the answer is always somewhere in between. So you can see quite nicely that in North Africa, quite early on already, especially the recitation of Warsh, that is the transmission of Warsh in the reading tradition of Nafi', becomes very, very popular. It is popular even today. That is the dominant reading of North Africa. And that seems to start really, really early on. It's strongly connected with the Maliki madhab, because Imam Malik thought of Nafi' as the reciter of the Quran. That was Sunnah. And well, as that spreads in North Africa, Warsh spreads in North Africa. So that's very early on already. Now, if you go to Basra, there were a lot of different readers there. Within the canon, we have 2 Basran readers. But outside of the canon, we have full descriptions of others. We have Al-Hasan al-Basri. We have Salam, who was the teacher of Yaqub, one of the canonical ones. Let me get this right. Abu Hatim al-Sijistani. So there's a whole bunch of readers in that region where we actually know that they differed from what the canon was and were doing different things. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So when did Abu Amr become the canonical reader of Basra? We don't know. That's something to figure out, and it's something to look into and kind of figure out what's going on. And so we're flying at it from 2 directions. I'm looking at the manuscripts. Jeremy is looking at the isnads and kind of prosopography of the different readers, who was learning from whom, who were around, what does the tradition know about, to what extent can we maybe connect these things up with manuscripts? Well, there's a lot of questions still totally open there, so I cannot say anything about that yet. But that's kind of the gist of what I'm trying to figure out with this project.
Sounds very interesting.
Well, as you sort of touched on several times, many people have quite a fixed understanding of the Quran's language, depending on what perspective that they're coming from. So how has your work, which is challenging a lot of those understandings, been received, both within sort of the academic communities, and we've touched on a little bit how it's been received in the Muslim communities in terms of the way it's been mischaracterized, but have you encountered resistance or criticism within academic communities towards your work?
Yeah. So I think it's always hard to tell within the academic community how people seem to be excited about what I'm doing and seem to like what I've done. But there's very few linguists in the field. So I'm, back in the days of say, the 19th century, or the early 20th century, people like Nildeke were just excellent linguists as well as excellent philologists and people in Quranic studies. I'd love to ask them and say, what did you think of my book? But I can't. They've been dead for 100 years. And so today, sorry.
ChatGPT.
Yes, maybe I should use that. So there's been there's this kind of question of so few people are really doing linguistic work within the Quran these days. So I'm kind of on my own in that sense, and so, but people seem to like it. Some people, some of my conclusions people find very difficult to swallow. I argue, and that's quite revisionist, that the Quran did not originally have the full set of Arab that we have come to think of today as being part of the Quran. Might turn out to be wrong about that. I'm not very married to it, but I thought the argument was good to make and important to make, and show that these things are not obvious and should not be assumed by default, which is what has been the standard way of doing these things, rather than researching it, just declaring it. And it's like, well, no, we need to actually do linguistic research here. And so, those things have gotten some pushback here and there. A couple of reviews are coming out now of my book. Some of them are very positive. Others are, I think, relatively positive, or maybe a bit critical of some of the mistakes I made, of which I made many. And that's the way it goes. As long as that doesn't fundamentally affect my argument, I think it's fine. And within, the Muslim community, these kinds of weird kind of outshoots that happen with some video that goes viral, this is just part of the movement of social media, and you kind of have to roll with those punches every now and then, and that's the way it goes. I mean, it's irritating, it's distressing, it's not fun, but it mostly pains me just the way it paints academia as antagonistic to Muslims, which I think is the worst. But most of the time, people seem to enjoy what I do and what I'm interested in. If I go on Twitter, I've 26,000 followers or something like that. It's a huge amount. Those aren't all, Christian polemicists. That's 99% Muslims. Well, let's put it slightly lower. Maybe it's 90, but it's the vast majority. The vast majority of the people who follow me are Muslims. So clearly they get something out of what I do and find it interesting what they do. And I'm very glad that people have that, because I want to, celebrate this stuff. I'm excited about it, not because I want to, bring it all down. That seems like a huge waste of time. No, I want to celebrate this interesting and I think fascinating linguistic history and these kinds of things. And most of the time people seem to enjoy that, and seem to think that's interesting, worth talking about, worth engaging with. And I've always been very happy. Of course, I get pushback every now and then. People find something more difficult to swallow than other things, and it's made my arguments better. I've said things that were wrong on Twitter, and someone with more traditional schooling especially comes at me and it's like, well, what do you make of this report? What do you make of that? And that's more often than not really giving me new insights, and I'm very glad to get those. So I'm always happy to have that kind of interaction. So I think the reception has mostly been good, and also within the academia, I think reception is good, especially among linguists. All the linguists are like, so glad someone finally said it. So that's good. At least as linguists are in agreement what the method is to kind of look at these things, and what the conclusions are is something else. But I think the methodological point that I try to put together in my book is actually more important than the details of what it is about. The question is, we need to ask what the language of the Quran is. It's not an answer we have already. It's an answer that we should research and find. And most people seem to agree with that point.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, and I'm happy to hear that in general, your work has been received well, both in academia and by Muslims. And, that's something I've already been able to see, as I mentioned already, from Twitter. I don't see too many pushbacks. I don't think I've seen anybody bragging about how you've blocked them. But, with Twitter, I'm pretty sure all of us have had to block some people.
A lot of people.
I mean, I imagine with your following, you know, you might get a few wackos that come in, you know, that's just the nature of the beast with social media.
It is. It is. Yeah, no, it's once you like pass that 10,000 follower mark, you really need to start blocking liberally, which is what I started doing. So I have thousands of blocked people because, you know, people just do mean stuff, and it's like it's so hard to not get sucked up in that thing, and you know, and so I've definitely, you know, wrongfully blocked people. But it's like, am I going to put energy into figuring out whether this guy or this girl is being, you know, arguing in bad faith or good faith, or am I not going to lose energy on this? And I often decide I'm not going to lose energy on this. This is only going to distract me. Block. That's what I do. And you know, the only way to avoid that from doing is being polite, and that's the way it goes.
Well, you know, I don't have as many followers as you, so I haven't had to block so many people. But every year I have a day of atonement to where I unblock everyone.
Oh wow!
And if they're free to, if they want to add me again or follow me again,
that's something I might consider.
You know,
that's interesting.
Just as you mentioned, some people, depending on when I'm on social media and what kind of questions they ask, a lot is lost in translation via text. I might be a kind of heavy on the trigger. So that's one of the reasons why I went back and looked like, oh man, I probably shouldn't have blocked that person. I was having a bad day. So
and I think it's important to block when you have a bad day, because if you're gonna have a bad day and then, you know, go fight on Twitter, that's a terrible idea. Don't do it. I've done it. I cannot recommend it. But I like the Day of Atonement. I might do that. And so the people I blocked might have a party soon.
They might have had a change of heart while in Blockistan, as some people call it.
Yes, exactly.
All right. If you don't have, you know, we're finished with the interview. This has been a wonderful discussion. Like, you've taught us a whole lot. Again, out of all the interviews that I've had, this has been one that has been a great learning experience, because I approached not having much knowledge about Quranic linguistics, the history of the Quranic language. And so for myself, it's been very enlightening, not only reading your work, but also talking to you. So Roxana, if you have any words you'd like to close with, or Marijn, if you have any words you'd like to close with.
Yeah, well, I mean, the only real closing words I have is like, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. It's nice to kind of, you know, talk about these things again. It's been a while since I talked about my book. It's been out for a bit more than a year now. So it's fun to kind of go back and it's like, okay, what was my argument again? How did that stick together? So it was fun to go over it and see, you know, what kinds of things stick and kind of, you know, come out. And I'm very happy that, you know, with the questions you asked, it's very obvious that I think what the important points of my book are, that you kind of picked up on them. And I'm glad my book, which is pretty technical, is able to kind of communicate that. And so the last thing I'd say about it, the book is open access. You can download it. You can, for free. Anyone can get it. That's true for almost all of my papers. So if you want to learn more, you can go to my academia.edu page, and the links are there. Or just type my name and you'll find a bunch of videos about how I was looking for mistakes in the Quran, but you'll probably also find my papers. So yeah, no, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. And
you said something about your book being open access, and I'm 100% thankful for that. I'm hoping more publications that come out are like this, because normally sometimes in my podcast, I beat Brill over the head for the murderous prices that they have for some of their books. Wonderful publisher, and I really like a lot of their titles, but the prices, not only university libraries are buying Brill books. You know, some of us who happen to be working class or just work regular jobs, non-academics, purchase these things as well. So just something, if Brill is ever, the people at Brill are ever watching in the future. So all right, thank you, Dr. Van Putten. This has been wonderful. People can follow you on Twitter. We will leave links in the description for your book and the articles that you mentioned. And thanks again. This has been an excellent discussion.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Thanks so much.